About 6 months ago, I bought my Damasko DS30, which has turned out to be one of my favourite watches in my collection. But I almost didn't buy it. And I almost didn't buy it because I almost bought the Sinn 556i. Both of these watches have a lot of similarities, slightly with how it looks, but also the quality, and they're both German watches. But there are also lots of differences. Today, I've been able to get a Sinn 556i in my hand, so I can do a side-by-side comparison. Hello, you're watching James. My name's James, you're watching me, and I'm talking about watches. And today I'm doing a side-by-side comparison. I was trying to decide how I was going to do this because both of these watches are watches that I really like. But only one of them was one that I purchased myself. As I mentioned, I bought the DS30 by Damasko, but I almost bought the Sinn 556i. I have to admit, I almost bought it on many occasions. So now that I've been able to get some hands-on experience with it, now that I've been able to put these watches side by side, did I make the right decision? Well, let's put these watches next to each other. Let me show you the similarities between these two, and let me also show you the differences. Let's flip the camera and let's check out these watches. So when I sat down to try and pencil out this particular comparison, the comparison between the Sinn 556i and the Damasko DS30, I started to think, do I do a sort of a 1 to 10? Do I go dial 1 to 10, dial 1 to 10 and add them up at the bottom and say, this one is the best? Or do I do a, I like this one, tick, I don't like this one, cross, and so forth, and add up the ticks and see which one is the best? But as I did that, as I tried to do that, what I did notice is that it came down to my own personal sort of thoughts and likes and dislikes about both of these watches. So instead of doing that, instead of saying which one is better or worse, I'm just going to show you the similarities and difference of both of them, and then leave it to you to decide. I personally went with the DS30 when I purchased this watch, but I was certainly considering the Sinn 556 at the time. I'm glad that I went with the Damasko because I actually prefer it, but not for any specific reason beyond my own personal tastes. So let's put these watches side by side and let's see why I chose the Damasko and what actually are the similarities and differences between these two watches. So firstly, why am I looking to compare these two? Why am I putting these watches side by side? Well, it's because I was actually comparing them in my own head when I was thinking about purchasing one of these watches. For me, they are similar enough that they are sort of competitors almost. They're both a German brand watch. They both have that stark black, white sort of features on there. And for me, they are similar watches in a lot of aspects, but they are also different. Starting with the sizes. The Sinn case itself is 38.4, whereas the Damasko is 38.9, so it's a little bit bigger. The width of the Sinn is 11.3, whereas the Damasko is actually a little bit thinner, being 10.2. But the Sinn is actually a little bit smaller when it comes to the lug-to-lug. It is 45.4, whereas the Damasko is a little bit bigger, being 47.3. But they both have a lug width of 20 millimeters. So overall, the Damasko is a little bit bigger, but sits a little bit thinner on wrist. This is one of the reasons why I chose the Damasko over the Sinn. But when we concentrate more in on the dials, what we'll see is a little bit of a difference as well, not just in the general look of it, but the actual black itself. The Sinn has this absolutely incredible sort of inky, almost enamel shine black, whereas the Damasko is more of a sort of a matte black. And I think perhaps that is a great decision by both of these watches because when you are looking at the Sinn, there's a little bit less going on there, so having a really stunning black dial really adds something to the watch. Whereas if we look at the Damasko, there's a little bit more going on. So having a slightly less intrusive or less sort of popping dial perhaps was a great decision. But everything you see on these watches, both of them are all printed. Those hour markers, those minute markers are all printed. The logos are both printed, and the Made in Germany is printed. It then just comes down to the differences in the styles. You'll see the hour and minute markers are smaller in the Sinn, definitely bigger and a little bit more in your face on the Damasko. Plus the Damasko has that crosshairs cross there. You will of course see a splash of color on the Damasko, which is not on the Sinn, because this is the blue version, which has a blue second hand and a blue date window. But this one is also available in just white, so I think they are very comparable. And although the hands look quite similar, when we look closer, they are actually a little bit different. Similar sort of shape, but the Damaskos are a little bit bigger and there is more white on the Damasko, with the center being black. The balance on the second hand is black. But if you look closer at the Sinn, you'll see there's more black, making the sort of hands look like they're floating a little bit more on the Sinn, whereas on the Damasko, it really sort of feels more integrated into the dial. So I don't think there's a positive or negative in regards to those. There is just a difference. Both watches are covered by a piece of flat sapphire crystal, both have lots of AR coating, and both are super legible. These are very legible watches, and I can understand, and I certainly understand why I was sort of comparing both of these in my head when I was deciding to buy one over the other. But here becomes a bit of a big difference between the two. The case, not just the size, but it's actually the materials. The Sinn is made of 316 stainless steel. It's all brushed. It looks absolutely fantastic. It is very nice, but it is stainless steel. But the Damasko watch is made out of hardened coated submarine steel, which gives it a little bit of a different look, a different finish, and a different feel. It feels so soft, and it becomes very hard wearing. This watch has not got a mark on it, even though it is a couple of years old. And I've had many stories told to me about people who own these watches who say that you just can't scratch them. You can even almost hit it with a knife, basically, not that I would, and it won't scratch it. Whereas the Sinn with the standard 316 stainless steel definitely gets some marks on it. And you can see that when you're looking at the base of the clasp there, which is where you're always going to get some marks on watches, because Sam, my friend who I've lent this watch from, certainly has been wearing it, so it ends up with a few marks, which is not a bad thing. It is though something that is worth mentioning because it is quite a big difference between the two. But if you look at the general case shape, you can see they're actually fairly similar. So you can certainly see why they're somewhat comparable. They both even have semi-guarded crowns, which look a little bit similar. Also both have screw-down crowns, both giving 200 meters of water resistance, and both are also signed crowns. But there's another bit of technology on the Damasko that the Sinn doesn't have. It has a self-lubricating crown stem. There's some sort of technology in this watch that when you unscrew the crown and pull it out, it lubricates that stem, which is apparently going to give this movement and this sort of crown stem and all the parts to it a little bit more longevity. So there's a little bit of interesting technology in this watch, in the steel itself, but also in some of the things inside this watch. Now, the case back on the back of the Damasko is pretty simple, nothing too much to write home about. Whereas the back of the Sinn has a see-through case back showing off that movement. Now let's talk these movements because both of these watches have the same Sellita SW200 movement, so they are very comparable in regards to movements. Now, of course, another big difference between these two watches in particular is we have a bracelet and a leather strap. And okay, so they're not really comparable in regards to that, but there is something that is worth noting with these watches in regards to bracelets, because the Sinn on the bracelet here costs around about 2,000 Australian dollars. The Damasko on the leather strap costs a little bit under 2,000 Australian dollars. But you can get a bracelet for this, and the bracelet for this looks absolutely incredible. So incredible that I've actually ended up purchasing it. I'm just waiting for it to be made in the Damasko factory and waiting for them to send it out to me. But the bracelet is expensive. It is almost 1,000 Australian dollars, making a big gap in price between these two watches. 2,000-ish with the bracelet versus 3,000-ish with the bracelet. So we are now having something that really is a big difference between the two. And having a watch on a leather strap versus bracelet at the same price does create a little bit of an issue when it comes to buying watches, because for me, money is a factor, and it is a factor in regards to my thoughts about which watch I purchased. I was lucky enough to buy my Damasko on the used market for around about $1,000. So with the original price that I purchased it for, with the bracelet, basically brings me back to a new version of this Sinn. So for me, price worked out well, but Sam ended up with a new watch and I ended up with a used watch. I am going to say, however, that both of them are brilliant watches, and if you are comparing either of these watches or you're considering buying either of these watches, you are going to end up with a good watch no matter which you pick. Just it comes down to more sort of aesthetics. Guys, thank you so much for watching my comparison of these two amazing German watches. If you enjoyed this review or this comparison style, maybe you should check these watches or these videos out next.